The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Children's Hope Hospital in Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Keanu Reeves walked down the corridor with a small bag of gifts tucked under his arm. This wasn't his first visit to the hospital. In fact, he had been coming here quietly for years, far from the flashing cameras that usually followed him. Keanu nodded at the nurses who no longer did double takes when they saw him. He had become a familiar face in these halls. Today he was heading to the oncology ward where 10-year-old Tommy waited. The boy had been battling leukemia for almost 2 years, and Keanu had promised to bring him a special action figure from his latest movie. "Mr. Reeves," a nurse called out, smiling warmly. "Tommy's been asking about you all morning." Keanu's face lit up with a gentle smile. "Just Keanu, please," he reminded her, as he always did. "And I wouldn't miss it. Kid's got more courage than most adults I know." As he turned the corner toward Tommy's room, Keanu stopped short. There, just outside the door, stood a woman with her back to him. Even from behind, there was something instantly familiar about her. The way she stood, the slight tilt of her head as she spoke to someone inside the room. After nearly 20 years in Hollywood, Keanu had learned to recognize people from the smallest details. "Sandra," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Sandra Bullock turned around, surprise washing over her face before breaking into a wide, genuine smile. "Keanu, what on earth are you doing here?" For a moment they just looked at each other, both seeming equally surprised. It had been years since they had worked together, though they occasionally ran into each other at industry events where conversations were always brief and surrounded by too many people. "I could ask you the same thing," Keanu said, stepping forward to give her a warm hug. Sandra held up a colorful gift bag. "My cousin's daughter is here for surgery. Nothing too serious, thankfully, but I promised I'd visit." "You?" "I come by when I can," Keanu said simply, not elaborating on the years he'd spent visiting children here, never wanting publicity for it. "I'm seeing a brave young man named Tommy." A nurse walked by, smiling at them both. "You two know each other? That's wonderful. Ms. Bullock, Lily's just gone down for some tests. She'll be back in about an hour." Sandra nodded, then looked back at Keanu. "Well, looks like I have some time to kill. Want to grab a coffee in the cafeteria after you see Tommy? It's been too long." Keanu's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "I'd like that." 30 minutes later, they sat across from each other at a small table in the corner of the hospital cafeteria. The space was surprisingly quiet, with only a few tired-looking doctors and family members scattered around. Their paper cups of coffee steamed between them. "So," Sandra said, stirring a packet of sugar into her coffee, "how long have you been visiting kids here? And don't try to downplay it. The way those nurses looked at you tells me you're practically staff." Keanu looked down, a touch of color rising to his cheeks. "A while," he admitted. "There's something about these kids. They're fighting battles bigger than anything I could imagine, and they do it with such grace." Sandra nodded, understanding, in her eyes. "You always were different from the rest of Hollywood, you know that? Even back during Speed when everyone was losing their minds over how big the movie was, you were just you." "Look who's talking," Keanu laughed softly. "Miss, I'll just keep adopting every dog I see." They fell into easy conversation, the boy, years melting away. They talked about their recent projects, mutual friends, and memories from the sets they'd shared. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they'd just worked together yesterday instead of years ago. "Remember that scene in the lake house where we were supposed to be at different times but in the same space?" Sandra asked, leaning forward. "The crew had to keep reminding us not to look directly at each other." Keanu smiled at the memory. "The director kept yelling, 'You can't see her, Keanu. She's not there yet.'" Their laughter drew glances from nearby tables, but neither noticed. There was something comforting about being with someone who knew you from before the Oscar wins, before the personal losses, before life had carved its deeper lines into both their faces. As their laughter settled, Sandra studied Keanu's face. Despite his smile, there was something in his eyes, a kind of quiet sadness that seemed permanent now. She had seen glimpses of it over the years, in interviews or red carpet photos, but up close, it was more evident. "You okay?" she asked, gently. "And don't give me the standard 'I'm fine' that we all use." Keanu looked up, surprised by the directness of her question. For a moment he seemed about to brush it off, but then something shifted in his expression. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "About connections, how people come into our lives for reasons we don't understand until much later." Sandra nodded, giving him space to continue. "There's this story I've never told anyone," Keanu said, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Not the press, not friends. It happened during a really dark time for me." Sandra reached across the table, briefly touching his arm. "You don't have to." "I want to," Keanu interrupted gently. I think you might understand it in a way others wouldn't." Just then, Keanu's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and sighed. "My driver. I have to be at a meeting across town in an hour." Sandra couldn't hide her disappointment. "Rain check? I'm in town for another week." Keanu seemed to wrestle with something, then made a decision. "Are you free for dinner tonight? There's a small place in Venice Beach. Very quiet, no paparazzi. I could pick you up around 7? "I'd like that," Sandra said, surprised by how much she meant it. As they walked out together, a young nurse stopped them, her eyes wide with excitement. "I'm so sorry to bother you both, but I just have to say, You Two in Speed was the first movie my husband and I watched on our first date. We still watch it every anniversary." They thanked her, posed for a quick photo, and continued toward the exit. 27 years, Keanu mused as they walked. That movie came out 27 years ago. "Don't remind me," Sandra groaned. "I still remember how nervous I was meeting you. You were this cool action star and I was just the girl from Demolition Man. And I thought you were way too good to be in an action movie with me," Keanu admitted. They reached the hospital entrance, sunlight streaming through the glass doors ahead of them. For a moment they stood in that threshold between the quiet world inside and the busy one waiting outside. 7 o'clock? Sandra confirmed. Keanu nodded. "There's more to this story than I can tell you here. Something I think you should know." There was an intensity in his voice that made Sandra curious. What could Keanu possibly have to tell her that he'd kept to himself all these years? "Now you have to show up or I'll die of curiosity," she joked, trying to lighten the moment. As they parted ways outside the hospital, neither noticed the young volunteer who had recognized them both, or the way she quickly typed something on her phone. By evening, social media would be buzzing with rumors about Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock's secret hospital meeting. But for now, they were just two old friends who had reconnected by chance, with a conversation left unfinished and a story waiting to be told. The small restaurant in Venice Beach was exactly as Keanu had described. Quiet, dimly lit, and tucked away from the usual tourist spots. Sandra arrived 5 minutes early but found Keanu already waiting at a corner table, partially hidden behind a decorative plant. He stood when he saw her, that familiar gentle smile crossing his face. "You found it?" he said, pulling out her chair. "My driver got lost twice," Sandra laughed, settling into her seat. "I think that's a good sign it's properly hidden." The restaurant had only 8 tables, most of them empty on this quiet Tuesday evening. A single candle flickered between them, casting soft shadows across the wooden table. The waitress recognized them both but professionally maintained her composure, only a slight widening of her eyes betraying her excitement. After ordering drinks and food, a comfortable silence fell between them. Sandra noticed how Keanu seemed more relaxed here than at the hospital, his shoulders less tense, his eyes more present. "So," she finally said, "you were about to tell me a story that apparently only I would understand." Keanu nodded, taking a slow breath. "It happened in Chicago during the winter of 2003. I was filming there, and it was one of those brutally cold winters where the wind cuts right through you." Sandra nodded, remembering her own experiences with Chicago winters. "I was staying at a hotel downtown," Keanu continued. "Every morning I'd walk to this little coffee shop about 6 blocks away. There was this older man I'd see on the corner of Michigan Avenue, homeless, probably in his 70s, with these incredibly dignified eyes. Keanu paused as the waitress brought their drinks, a glass of red wine for Sandra, sparkling water for Keanu. Most people walked past him like he was invisible. Keanu continued after she left. But something about him. I couldn't do that. One morning I stopped and asked if he wanted coffee. His name was Walter, Keanu said, his voice softening with the memory. He had these hands, pianist's hands with long fingers, even though they were weathered and rough. When he took the coffee cup, I noticed how he held it, like he was touching piano keys. Sandra listened intently, watching how Keanu's eyes seemed to look somewhere beyond the restaurant, back into that Chicago winter. I started bringing him coffee every morning, then breakfast. We'd sit on this freezing bench, and at first he barely spoke. But gradually he started sharing bits of his story. Their food arrived, a simple pasta dish for Sandra, grilled fish for Keanu. But neither paid much attention to it. Walter had been a concert pianist, Keanu said. Not world famous, but respected. He'd played with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in the 1970s. Then his wife got sick, aggressive cancer. They had insurance, but not enough. You know how that goes. Sandra nodded. She'd heard too many similar stories over the years. He spent everything they had on treatments, sold their house, his piano, everything. After she died, he had nothing left. No family, no savings. He ended up on the streets. Keanu took a small sip of his water. By the time I met him, he'd been homeless for almost 8 years. That's heartbreaking, Sandra said quietly. What struck me wasn't just his story, but how he told it, Keanu said. No self-pity, no bitterness. He talked about his wife with such love, even after all those years. Said he'd make the same choices again. Keanu absent-mindedly pushed his food around with his fork. One day I asked if he missed playing. His whole face changed like I'd turned on a light inside him. He said, in every minute of every day. Sandra found herself barely touching her own meal, too caught up in Keanu's story. I had this idea, Keanu continued. The hotel where I was staying had a grand piano in a private room off the lobby. I asked the manager if we could use it early one morning before anyone was around. Pulled some strings. He smiled at the memory. The manager wasn't thrilled about bringing a homeless man into the 5-star hotel, but I can be persistent. I bet you can, Sandra said with a knowing smile. I picked Walter up at 5 a.m., got him cleaned up, found some decent clothes. When I brought him to that piano, Keanu shook his head, his eyes growing bright with emotion. Sandra, I wish you could have seen it. The way his hands hovered over the keys like he was afraid they might disappear if he touched them. Keanu fell silent for a moment, seemingly lost in the memory. Did he play? Sandra prompted gently. He sat there for almost 5 minutes without touching a key, Keanu said. Then he looked at me and said, I haven't touched a piano in 9 years. And then he played. Keanu's voice grew softer. It was Chopin, a nocturne. His fingers were stiff at first, missing notes, but then it was like watching someone come back to life. By the end, he was playing like those 9 years had never happened. Sandra could almost hear the music in the way Keanu described it, his hands slightly moving as if following the remembered notes. I went back to my room and cried, Keanu admitted simply. I couldn't understand a world where someone with that gift was sleeping on heating grates. The waitress came by to check on them, but seeing their barely touched food and the intensity of their conversation, she quietly backed away. What happened to him? Sandra asked. I had about 3 more weeks of filming, Keanu said. I got him, a room at a decent hotel nearby. Brought him clothes, food. I found a community center with a piano he could use. Keanu took another sip of water. Before I left Chicago, I set him up with 6 months of rent at an apartment and connected him with a social worker I'd found who genuinely cared. I gave him my number and told him to call if he needed anything. Did he? Sandra asked. Once, Keanu nodded. About 2 months later. Not to ask for money or help. He called to tell me he'd started teaching piano to kids at the community center. said one boy reminded him of himself at that age. Keanu smiled at the memory. We kept in touch. I'd call when I was in Chicago. He was doing okay, not great, but okay. The teaching gave him purpose. That's a beautiful story, Keanu, Sandra said. But I'm still not understanding why you're telling me this now, or what it has to do with me. Keanu looked directly at her, now. One day, Walter told me about his first piano teacher. He was 10 years old from a poor family. His teacher saw something in him and gave him free lessons for years. Said she changed his life. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old worn photograph, sliding it across the table. Her name was Margaret Bullock. Sandra's breath caught. The photo showed a young Walter standing beside an older woman with a kind face and familiar eyes. Eyes Sandra had seen in family photos all her life. My great-aunt Margaret, she whispered, picking up the photo with trembling fingers. But how? I didn't make the connection at first, Keanu explained. Walter just called her Miss Margaret. It wasn't until years later when I saw your family in an interview. You were talking about your aunt who taught music in Chicago. Something clicked. Sandra stared at the photo, memories flooding back. Aunt Margaret taught piano for almost 50 years. My mom used to tell me stories about how she'd give free lessons to talented kids who couldn't afford them. Walter was one of those kids, Keanu said simply. He told me she'd spotted him at a school performance and told his parents he had a gift that shouldn't be wasted. When they explained they couldn't afford lessons, she offered to teach him for free. Sandra looked up from the photo, her eyes glistening. She never married, never had children of her own, but she always said her students were her family. Walter said the same thing about her, Keanu said. He told me she was the first person who ever believed he could be something more than what his circumstances suggested. The candle between them flickered, casting dancing shadows across their faces as the weight of this connection settled over them. There's more to the story, Keanu said quietly. And it gets more unbelievable. Sandra carefully placed the photo on the table between them, her dinner completely forgotten now. Tell me. Keanu glanced around the nearly empty restaurant, then leaned forward. Walter passed away 3 years ago, he said. But before he did, he left something incredible behind. Something I've been keeping safe, waiting for the right moment, the right person to share it with. What is it? Sandra asked, completely drawn into his story now. Before we get to that, Keanu said, there's something you need to hear first. Something Walter created that I think belongs in some way to your family too. The waitress approached, again seeing their untouched food. Is everything okay with your meals? They both looked up, momentarily pulled from the bubble of their conversation. Everything's perfect, Keanu assured her. But I think we might need these to go, and the check, please. As the waitress walked away, Keanu turned back to Sandra. Would you like to come with me somewhere? There's something I need to show you. That can't be explained with words. Sandra nodded without hesitation. Lead the way. Keanu's car wound through the quiet streets of Venice Beach, heading north toward the Pacific Palisades. Sandra sat in the passenger seat, still holding the worn photograph of her great-aunt Margaret standing beside young Walter. The night air coming through the slightly opened window was cool against her face. So where exactly are we going? She asked, glancing at Keanu's profile illuminated by passing streetlights. My place, he answered simply. What I need to show, he was there. Sandra had known Keanu for decades, yet she realized she'd never been to his home. Few people had. Despite his fame, he'd always been intensely private, managing somehow to keep his personal life out of the tabloids in a way most celebrities couldn't. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about the strange connection they'd discovered. Sandra looked down at the photograph again, studying her great-aunt's face. I only met her a few times, Sandra said finally. She died when I was 12. But I remember her hands. They were always moving like they were playing invisible keys. And she hummed constantly, little bits of classical pieces. Keanu smiled. Walter did the same thing. His fingers would tap rhythms on his knees when he talked. They turned onto a quiet street lined with tall hedges that shielded the homes from view. Keanu slowed the car and pulled into a driveway, where a simple but elegant gate opened automatically. Unlike the flashy mansions of many Hollywood stars, Keanu's home was modest by celebrity standards. A mid-century modern house with clean lines and warm lighting visible through large windows. "I always imagined you lived in some kind of minimalist monastery," Sandra joked as they got out of the car. Keanu laughed. "Not far off. I don't spend much time here anyway." Inside, the house was exactly as Sandra might have expected, sparsely furnished but with carefully chosen pieces. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with well-worn volumes. A motorcycle helmet sat on a side table. There were few personal photos, but several striking pieces of art hung on the walls. "This way," Keanu said, leading her through the living room, toward what appeared to be a small studio space in the back of the house. The room they entered was different from the rest of the home, clearly a working space rather than a showpiece. A computer desk sat in one corner with professional audio equipment. Instruments hung on the walls, a few guitars, a violin. In the center of the room stood a beautiful upright piano, not ostentatious but clearly of high quality. "I didn't know you played," Sandra said, gesturing toward the piano. "I don't," Keanu replied. "Not really. I can pick out a few notes, but—" He trailed off, running his hand lightly over the piano's glossy surface. "I bought this for Walter, actually. The last few years of his life, he'd come here when he was in town. He'd play for hours." Keanu moved to the computer and woke it from sleep mode. "After our paths crossed that winter in Chicago, Walter and I stayed connected. I'd check in on him, make sure he was okay. The apartment worked out for a while, but eventually his health started failing. He clicked through some files on the computer. About 6 years ago, he called me. He'd been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. He was terrified, not of dying, but of forgetting his music." Sandra sat in a chair near the piano, watching Keanu's face as he spoke. The soft lighting in the studio cast gentle shadows, making the moment feel intimate, almost like a confession. "I brought him out here," Keanu continued. "Set him up with good doctors. He stayed in my guest house for almost 3 years. He smiled at a private memory. He'd wake up at dawn every day and play. Said the morning light through those windows reminded him of the concert hall where he used to perform. That's why you have the piano," Sandra said softly. Keanu nodded. During that time, he started composing again. Music, he said, had been inside him for decades, but he'd never written down. As his memory began to fade, he became almost desperate to get it all out. He turned back to the computer, opening a folder labeled simply Walter. Inside were dozens of audio files with dates as titles. "I hired a sound engineer to record everything," Keanu explained. "Walter would forget things, what day it was, sometimes even my name. But he never forgot how to play. The doctors said it was stored in a different part of his brain." Keanu selected a file and paused before playing it. "The first time he played, this piece for me, he told me a story about your great-aunt Margaret. He said when he was 14, his father lost his job and they couldn't afford heat in their apartment that winter. Margaret invited him to practice at her home every day after school, always with a hot meal waiting. He pressed play, and the room filled with piano music, a piece that started gently, almost tentatively, before building into something deeply moving, with complex emotions woven through the notes. It wasn't polished like a professional recording. In the background, they could hear the occasional creak of the piano bench, the distant sound of birds outside the window. It felt raw, intimate. Sandra closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. There was something hauntingly familiar about it. Not that she'd heard this specific piece before, but something in its structure, its emotional language that resonated with her.
"He called this Margaret's Garden," Keanu said quietly as the piece continued. "He said your aunt had this small garden behind her house where students would sit in warm weather. She taught them to listen to the rhythms in nature. Birds, wind through leaves, even the pattern of raindrops."
He said it changed how he heard music forever. As the piece reached its conclusion, Sandra opened her eyes to find her vision blurred with tears. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "There's more," Keanu said, scrolling through the files. He composed, Nearly 30 pieces during those years. Some are just fragments, others fully developed. This one, he selected another file. He finished just weeks before he died. The new piece began, darker and more complex than the first, with moments of dissonance that resolved into unexpected harmony. Despite the technical complexity, there was something deeply human about it. The sound of someone pouring their life, experience into music. He called this one the speed of memory, Keanu said with a small smile. He had seen our movie on TV one afternoon. He joked that his memories were racing away from him like that bus, and he was trying to keep them from exploding. Sandra gave a soft laugh through her tears. As the music continued, Keanu moved to a cabinet and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Walter kept journals his whole life. When he knew his memory was failing, he became obsessive about writing things down. He handed the journal to Sandra. This one has entries from the 1960s when he was studying with your aunt. I've never read them all. Felt too private somehow, but I think you should have them. Sandra carefully opened the journal. Inside, in neat handwriting, were daily entries detailing lessons, music theory, and personal reflections. She turned to a random page and read, "Miss Margaret said something today I won't forget. I was frustrated with a difficult passage in the Beethoven Sonata. She said, 'Music isn't in the notes, Walter. It's in the silence between them, in the way one note reaches for the next. Like life, the meaning isn't in the events, but in the connections between them.' I think I finally understood what she meant when I played it again." "There are 6 more journals," Keanu said, gesturing to the cabinet. His whole life, documented, including the years on the streets. He never stopped writing, even then. The second piece ended, leaving the room in silence that felt charged with emotion. "I don't understand," Sandra said finally, closing the journal carefully. "Why have you kept all this private? These compositions, they're remarkable. They should be heard." Keanu sat down across from her. "That's just it. Walter didn't want them published or performed. He was clear about that. He said they weren't meant for audiences or critics. They were his conversations with the past, with your aunt, with his wife, with the life he'd lived." "Then why record them at all?" Sandra asked. "For the same reason he kept journals," Keanu said. "He was afraid of his memories disappearing completely, as if they'd never existed. The music was his proof that his life had mattered, that those connections had been real." Sandra looked around the studio at the piano where Walter had spent his final years bringing his music to life, at the shelves of journals documenting a remarkable journey from gifted child to homeless man to composer. "And why are you sharing this with me now?" she asked softly. Keanu was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Walter passed away 3 years ago. His last coherent request was that I find a way to honor what your aunt did for him, but without betraying his privacy. I've been trying to figure out how to do that ever since he met her eyes directly. When I saw you today at the hospital, it felt like one of those connections Walter and your aunt talked about, something that couldn't be coincidence. Like I was meant to tell you this story." Sandra looked down at the journal in her hands, feeling the weight of the trust being placed in her. "What do you think we should do with all this?" "That's what I wanted to ask you," Keanu said. "These journals, this music, they're as much your family's legacy as they are Walter's. I think we're supposed to figure it out together." Sandra stood and walked to the piano, placing her hand on its smooth surface where Walter's hands had once created such beauty. "Play another piece," she said. "I need to hear more." As Keanu turned back to the computer to select another recording, Sandra felt a strange sense of certainty. Whatever happened next, this unexpected connection across decades had brought her here for a reason, and something important was about to begin. Morning light streamed through the large windows of Keanu's living room. Sandra sat cross-legged on the couch, surrounded by Walter's journals, a mug of coffee cooling beside her. She'd been reading for hours, completely absorbed in the life story unfolding through the pages. Keanu entered quietly from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, refilling her mug. Sandra looked up, her eyes tired but bright with excitement. It's incredible, Keanu. These aren't just music lessons, they're like a roadmap of how one person completely changed the course of another person's life through small acts of kindness. She carefully closed the journal she'd been reading and picked up another. Did you know my aunt used to take Walter to concerts, not just classical music, but jazz clubs, folk singers, everything? She believed musicians should listen widely. Keanu nodded, sitting across from her. He mentioned that, said it shaped his composing style. You can hear it in his pieces, that blend of classical structure with jazz-like improvisation. They'd spent most of the night in Keanu's studio, listening to Walter's recordings, reading his journals in turns. Sandra had called her cousin to explain she wouldn't be back to her hotel, and they'd continued their exploration of Walter's legacy until exhaustion finally forced them to take a short break. I found something else, Sandra said, opening a journal, dated 1992. This was during his homeless years. Listen to this. Today marks 30 years since Margaret Bullock's passing. I played her favorite Bach prelude in my head while sitting in the public library. An old woman smiled at me, perhaps seeing my fingers moving on the table. Margaret always said music doesn't need an instrument to be real. I understand that now more than ever. Sandra looked up at Keanu, her expression soft with emotion. He remembered the exact date my aunt died, even during his hardest times. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Walter told me once that when he was living on the streets, he'd go to the Chicago Public Library almost every day. They had a record collection, and the librarians would let him use the headphones to listen to classical music for hours. He said it kept him sane. Sandra flipped through a few more pages, then stopped suddenly. Wait, look at this. She held out the journal, pointing to a page where a small newspaper clipping had been carefully taped. It was yellowed with age, but the headline was still legible. Local music teacher leaves endowment for student scholarships. That's my aunt, Sandra said, reading the short article. When she died, she left her modest savings to start a scholarship fund for gifted music students who couldn't afford lessons. The fund only lasted about 10 years before the money ran out, but it helped several kids. Keanu took the journal gently, studying the clipping. Walter never mentioned this. Maybe he didn't know, Sandra suggested. Or maybe... She paused, thinking. Maybe it was too painful to think about. That other kids were getting the opportunity he once had while he was struggling to survive. They sat in silence for a moment, considering the layers of connection between Walter, Margaret, and now themselves. How lives could intersect across decades in ways no one could predict. I think I know what we should do, Sandra said finally. Walter wanted us to honor what my aunt did for him without exposing his privacy. What if we restart her scholarship fund? Keanu nodded slowly, considering. We could create a foundation, the Margaret Bullock Music Foundation, for talented kids who need financial support. Exactly, Sandra said, her voice growing excited. We could fund it ourselves to get it started, then maybe hold a benefit concert. We could have professional musicians perform pieces inspired by Walter's compositions, not playing his actual music, since that was private, but new works inspired by his story. We wouldn't need to use his name or share his personal journals, Keanu added, warming to the idea. Just the essence of his story. A gifted musician who lost everything, but never lost his music. Sandra set the journals aside and moved to sit beside Keanu. But there's something else we need to consider, she said, her tone growing serious. Walter's story isn't just about music. It's about how quickly someone's life can fall apart due to medical bills, how a person with extraordinary gifts can end up on the streets. Keanu nodded. You're right. His story has a lot to say about the healthcare system, about how we treat the homeless. So maybe the foundation could be broader, Sandra suggested. Music scholarships, yes, but also support for musicians facing medical crises, and perhaps partnerships with organizations that use music therapy for people experiencing homelessness. They spent the next few hours outlining ideas, their conversation flowing easily, building on each other's thoughts as if they'd been working together for years. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting shifting patterns of light across the room. There's something else in these journals that keeps coming up, Sandra said, returning to the pages. Walter writes a lot about how playing music kept him connected to his humanity during his darkest times. He has this phrase he repeats, "The notes remember even when I forget." Keanu smiled. He used to say that, especially in those last years, when his memories were slipping away. He'd forget what he'd had for breakfast, but he could still play Chopin perfectly. Sandra closed the journal carefully. I think that needs to be part of this too. Using music to help people hold on to themselves during difficult times. She stood and walked to the large window overlooking the garden, where morning light illuminated a simple Japanese-inspired landscape. You know what's strange? I came to Los Angeles for just 3 days to visit my cousin's daughter. If you hadn't been at that hospital yesterday, none of this would be happening. Walter would probably say there's no such thing as coincidence, Keanu said, joining her at the window. My aunt used to say something similar, Sandra replied. She called them grace notes, those unexpected moments that change the melody of your life. They stood side by side, looking out at the peaceful garden. Despite having slept only a few hours, Sandra felt energized, filled with purpose in a way she hadn't experienced in years. If we're going to do this, Keanu said, we should visit Chicago, see the places from the journals, maybe even find the building where your aunt taught. Walter described it so many times I feel like I could walk right to it. I'd like that, Sandra said softly. It's been years since I've been back there. Keanu turned to face her. There's something else we should consider. If we announce this foundation together, the press will have a field day. They'll turn it into some kind of Hollywood romance story. Sandra laughed. Let them. It might help draw attention to the cause. Besides, we're both too old to worry about tabloid stories. Speak for yourself, Keanu joked, though his eyes remained serious. But we should be prepared. Once this becomes public, Walter's privacy could be at risk. Journalists might try to uncover his identity. Sandra nodded, understanding his concern. We'll need to be careful about how much we share. The essence of the story without the details that could identify him. And we should decide what to do with these, Keanu added, gesturing toward the journals and recordings. They're too important to risk losing. We could create an archive, Sandra suggested, sealed for 50 years or so. By then, anyone who might recognize Walter would be gone, but his music and words would be preserved. Keanu considered this, then nodded. I like that. A time capsule of sorts. Sandra's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it quickly. My cousin, checking if I'm still in town. She typed a quick reply, then looked back at Keanu. I should probably head back soon. Her daughter's being discharged from the hospital today. I'll drive you, Keanu offered. But before we go, there's one more recording I think you should hear. They returned to the studio where Keanu sat at the computer and searched through files. This was the last piece Walter completed, he explained. About a month before he died. His hands were getting weaker and you can hear some hesitation in places, but, well, just listen. The music that filled the room was unlike the other pieces they'd heard. Where those had been complex and technically impressive, this was simpler, almost childlike in its melody, yet deeply moving. It began with a single line that reminded Sandra of a lullaby, then gradually added layers that created a sense of conversation between different voices. He called this one, The Circle, Keanu said quietly, as the piece played. He told me it represented how everything in life eventually comes full circle, how the child he once was, learning from your aunt, had somehow returned to him at the end of his life. As the music reached its conclusion, Sandra noticed tears on Keanu's cheeks. In all the years she'd known him, through movie sets and award ceremonies, she'd never seen him cry. You really cared about him, she said softly. Keanu nodded, wiping his face without embarrassment. He changed me, made me see things differently. He paused the recording. That's why this foundation is so important. It's not just about honoring Walter or your aunt. It's about continuing what they started. Sandra reached out and squeezed his hand. Then let's get started. As they gathered their things to leave, Sandra took one last look at the piano where Walter had created such beautiful music after so many years of silence. She felt a deep certainty that the connection they'd discovered was just the beginning of something important, something that would reach far beyond themselves to touch lives they couldn't yet imagine. "Ready?" Keanu asked, keys in hand. "Ready," Sandra replied, following him out into the bright California morning, already mentally composing the first notes of their new project together. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Symphony Center was filled with people dressed in their finest. The buzz of conversation and the gentle clinking of glasses created a pleasant hum throughout the space. On a stage decorated with simple white flowers, a string quartet played softly. Sandra stood near the entrance greeting guests as they arrived. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her hair swept up. Despite having attended countless Hollywood premieres and award shows, she felt unusually nervous tonight. "Breathe," a familiar voice said beside her. Keanu had appeared at her elbow, looking remarkably comfortable in a well-tailored suit. "Everything is going perfectly." "I know," Sandra said, smiling at him. "I just want it to be worthy of them, Walter and Aunt Margaret." "It already is," Keanu assured her, briefly touching her arm. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of planning and preparation. After their discovery of Walter's journals and music, Sandra and Keanu had thrown themselves into creating the Margaret Bullock Music Foundation. They'd traveled to Chicago together, visiting the places mentioned in Walter's journals, the building, where Margaret had taught piano lessons for decades, the concert hall where Walter had once performed, even the street corner where Keanu had first met him years ago. Sandra had dug through old family photos and records, learning more about her great-aunt's life. Margaret Bullock had taught music for nearly 50 years, often giving free lessons to children from poor families. She'd never married but had created a family through her students, many of whom had gone on to careers in music. Tonight was the official launch of the foundation, a charity gala that had drawn an impressive mix of musicians, philanthropists, and celebrities. The press had indeed had a field day with Sandra and Keanu working together on a mysterious project, but they'd managed to keep Walter's full story private, sharing only that they'd discovered a connection between a gifted musician who'd experienced homelessness and Sandra's great-aunt who had been his teacher. "The mayor just arrived," Keanu murmured, nodding toward the door. Sandra greeted the mayor of Chicago warmly. "Thank you for supporting this project," she said. "It means a lot to have the city involved." "The pleasure is mine," the mayor replied. "A foundation that combines music education with support for the homeless population? That's exactly the kind of initiative we need." As the mayor moved on, Sandra caught sight of a young woman entering with a violin case. "That's her," she whispered, to Keanu. "Violet Chen, the first recipient of our scholarship." Violet was 16, a gifted violinist from the south side of Chicago, whose family couldn't afford the specialized training she needed. When the foundation had announced its first scholarship, her music teacher had immediately submitted her application, including recordings that had left the selection committee speechless. Keanu watched as Sandra went to greet the young musician, introducing her to several professionals who could help further her career. In the months they'd worked together, he'd seen a new side of Sandra, passionate, detail-oriented, completely dedicated to making the foundation a success. She'd postponed 2 film projects to focus on it, spending countless hours on video calls with him to plan every aspect of tonight's event. At precisely 8 o'clock, Sandra took the stage. The room quieted as she approached the microphone. "Good evening, and thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Tonight marks the official beginning of the Margaret Bullock Music Foundation. Some of you have asked why. Keanu Reeves and I, who aren't known for our musical talents, have created this organization." A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. "The truth is, we were brought together by an extraordinary story of connection and coincidence, or perhaps it wasn't coincidence at all." She gestured for Keanu to join her on stage. He walked up and stood beside her, his presence calm and grounding. 6 months ago, Keanu continued, we discovered that our lives had been touched by the same 2 people, a gifted pianist who experienced homelessness, and a dedicated music teacher who changed his life decades earlier. Sandra nodded. That music teacher was my great-aunt, Margaret Bullock, who taught piano in Chicago for nearly 50 years. The pianist was a man who, despite extraordinary talent, lost everything due to his wife's medical bills. Their story spans decades, from the 1960s to just a few years ago. We promised to protect this musician's privacy, Keanu added. But we can tell you that his journey showed us how quickly anyone's life can be derailed by circumstances beyond their control, and how the power of music can help someone hold on to their humanity even in the darkest times. Sandra gestured toward the back of the room, where large display boards showed black and white photos of Margaret Bullock's studio, along with anonymous excerpts from Walter's journals, carefully chosen to protect his identity while sharing his wisdom. The Margaret Bullock Music Foundation has 3 primary missions, Sandra explained. First, to provide scholarships to gifted young musicians who lack financial resources. Second, to support professional musicians facing medical or financial crises. And third, to fund music therapy programs for people experiencing homelessness. Music isn't just entertainment, Keanu said, his voice soft but carrying throughout the room. It's a lifeline. It's memory when memory fails. It's dignity when dignity is threatened. It's connection when we feel most alone. Sandra looked out at the audience, feeling a swell of emotion. Tonight, we're honored to introduce our first scholarship recipient, an extraordinary young violinist named Violet Chen. Violet took the stage, her posture perfect as she lifted her violin. The piece she played was not one of Walter's compositions. Those remained private as he had wished. Instead, she performed a new piece commissioned for the occasion, inspired by themes from Walter's music, but transformed into something new. As the final notes faded, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Violet bowed deeply, her face flushed with accomplishment. The rest of the evening unfolded beautifully. A renowned pianist performed. The Chicago Children's Choir sang. Donations poured in, far exceeding Sandra and Keanu's expectations. By the time the last guests departed, the foundation had raised enough to fund scholarships for 10 students and launched 2 music therapy programs in homeless shelters. We did it, Sandra said quietly as she and Keanu stood in the empty ballroom afterward. Staff moved around them, clearing tables and taking down decorations. Walter would be proud, Keanu replied. And your aunt too. Sandra nodded, feeling a pleasant exhaustion settle over her. I keep thinking about something I read in one of Walter's journals. He wrote that music isn't created in isolation. It needs both the composer and the listener to become complete. Each person who hears it makes it their own in some way. That's what we've done with their story, Keanu said. We've made it our own, transformed it into something new. They walked together toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the nearly empty space. Will you come to the shelter tomorrow? Sandra asked. The piano arrives at 10 and the first music therapy session starts at 11. I wouldn't miss it, Keanu assured her. Outside, Chicago's night air was cool and clear. Stars were visible, above the city lights, unusually bright for an urban sky. I have something for you, Keanu said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet pouch and handed it to Sandra. She opened it carefully and found a delicate silver necklace with a small piano key pendant. Turning it over, she saw an engraving. The notes remember. Walter's words, she whispered. I had it made from one of the keys of his piano, Keanu explained. The piano needed some restoration and the technician had to replace a few keys. I kept one. Sandra was speechless, deeply touched by the gesture. She turned and Keanu gently fastened the necklace around her neck. Perfect, he said softly. They stood together on the sidewalk, the Chicago Symphony Center illuminated behind them. In the 6 months they'd worked together on the foundation, their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected, a partnership based on shared purpose and mutual respect. What happens now? Sandra asked, touching the piano key, pendant at her throat. Now we keep going, Keanu said simply. There are 9 more scholarships to award, music therapy programs to launch, Walter's archives to preserve for future generations. It's strange, Sandra said as they began walking toward their hotel. When we ran into each other at that hospital, I never imagined we'd end up here. Life has these turning points, Keanu replied. Small moments that change everything. Meeting Walter was one for me. Finding you at the hospital was another. A taxi pulled up beside them, and Keanu opened the door for Sandra. Before getting in, she turned to him. You know the press is going to keep speculating about us, she said with a small smile. They can't seem to accept that two people might work together without romance being involved. Keanu shrugged, unconcerned. Let them talk. We know what this is really about. Walter and Margaret, Sandra said. And music, Keanu added. And second chances. As they rode back to their hotel, Sandra looked out at the Chicago skyline, thinking about how a chance encounter had led to tonight's success. She thought about Walter playing piano in Keanu's studio, holding on to his dignity and his art, despite everything he'd lost. She thought about her great-aunt Margaret, teaching music to children who couldn't afford lessons, creating ripples that continued long after her death. The foundation was just beginning, but already it had changed lives. Violet's, the homeless shelter residents who would start music therapy tomorrow, and yes, her own and Keanu's too. What had started as a strange coincidence had become a mission, a purpose larger than themselves. The taxi stopped at their hotel. As they walked through the lobby, Sandra noticed a beautiful grand piano in the corner. She paused, touching the piano key pendant at her throat. Do you think Walter is watching somehow? She asked softly. Keanu followed her gaze to the piano. I don't know, he said honestly. But I think his music is still playing, in its own way. Through Violet, through the foundation, through everyone who hears this story and is moved by it. The notes, remember? Sandra whispered. Even when we forget. Together they headed toward the elevators, already discussing plans for tomorrow's shelter visit, for the next scholarship recipient, for the future they were building note by note, day by day, one life at a time.